Hello again, gang. KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about rivers, because rivers are perhaps the most important geographic feature of human civilization. Rivers provide first and foremost a reliable source of fresh drinking water, much more so than wells. Rivers provide a food source of animals living in the river and under the riverbed, and those that are drawn to the river for drinking water. Rivers provide water for irrigation for crops, and the soil around rivers is often very fertile, excellent for growing crops. And finally, rivers are an excellent source of transportation, both people and goods, up and down the river and through the networks of tributaries. Hence, the major rivers of the earth are iconic symbols of their region. The Nile in Egypt, the Ganges in India, the Yangtze in China, are emblematic both for ancient and modern times. You also have European rivers like the Thames, the Seine, the Danube, that are iconic of that period, which we often associate with classical D&D. And of course, you've got the epic rivers such as the Mississippi in the United States or the Amazon in South America. But rivers are more than just emblematic of the real world. They can serve as excellent templates for building, storylines, encounters, and realism in your homebrewed world. And for that reason, rivers are really more than just a one episode thing. I'm going to do several. In this, I'm going to describe various types of rivers and how they can be adapted to the mechanics of D&D, because they are the lifeblood not only of the various civilizations that you see in the world of D&D, but also the monsters and NPCs who inhabit, huge swaths of areas. When I create a continent, the first thing I do is I create the coastline of that continent. But the second thing I do is think about the river systems, because I know that the races, the player character races and NPCs and whatnot are going to congregate along rivers and at the mouths of rivers on the coastline. But monsters and any creatures are going to congregate where there's water. And when you're creating these river systems, you're also thinking about them as a means of transportation to different areas of your world, and also as natural boundaries, whether between kingdoms or the hunting grounds of various creatures. And the thing is, since rivers are such an excellent source of transportation for people and goods, they also attract predators who see this as an opportunity to find people perhaps vulnerable on the river, but also predators who are just looking out for creatures who are stopping to get a drink. So I'm going to divide my rivers into three types: the epic river, the tributary, and the exotic river. And I'll say these descriptions are simply for the game mechanics of D&D, because technically an exotic river is a river which flows through a desert, comes out of a human source, and then flows into that, perhaps disappearing. That's for scientists, hydrologists and whatnot. This is for the world of D&D, because I'm going to use these categories to serve as different markers for the world building aspects and legendarium of a homebrewed world. And they are going to be useful in terms of the types of encounters and storylines that you can build around them. So we'll begin with the epic river, and it is probably what you would suppose, a classic, huge river like the Nile or the Mississippi. Almost always a wide, powerful river that flows into the sea, though not always. There's the Volga, and the Ural River flows into the Caspian Sea, which is an inland sea. It doesn't flow out anywhere. It's just eliminates through evaporation. I usually have one or two epic rivers on a continent that I build, but you could certainly have more. You just don't want to stretch your suspension of disbelief if you have like 20 giant rivers. Or, your continent becomes something else. It almost becomes like archipelagos, which you could have. And the epic river in the real world is a classical natural barrier. Certainly in medieval times, most epic rivers were not bridged. The Thames is an epic river in part because of its historical significance to England. And there were areas, even though it's wide in these areas where it's shallow enough, that could be bridged. In fact, it has been bridged, the Thames, from Roman times. But most truly epic rivers are simply too broad, too swift and deep to be bridged, except by magical means. And this brings us into a subcategory of the types of rivers. Yes, I love to do this. And that is, what are the features of these categories that are easily incorporated into the game mechanics and storytelling of the world of D&D. So let's say you have an epic river that's broad and very deep that could not possibly be bridged in the pre-industrial world that we associate with D&D. Well, you'd simply have magical spells that would allow someone to build a bridge over such a ordinarily unbridgeable river. But a bridge like this would be rare and closely guarded because it's the only crossing port. In terms of people on foot or with carts, they charge a toll to cross here and be closely guarded. Because just as in the real world, epic rivers form a natural barrier between kingdoms, this crossing point, it could be closed off in times of war to prevent the enemy from getting across. Now, if you run a world of kingdoms that are largely settled, and this is the single crossing point, and there's some epic battle between these kingdoms, this river becomes very important. If a small group could get across the river, seize control, and keep it open for the army to get across, this could swing the battle. Now, this would have to be a small group of intrepid adventurers. The other cool thing about epic rivers is when they flow into the sea, they often create vast deltas. These are areas that are usually very fertile soil. They also flood all the time. They also can have, inaccessible like marshes or swamps or whatnot that make travel through there very difficult. And these marshes and swamps, interesting areas for encounters, storylines, creatures that hide out in the swamp and then come forth to attack, whether it's livestock on the farms or the farmers themselves. You can also have towns or villages on these deltas that reflect the difficulty of the terrain. If this land has been reclaimed through dikes or levees, perhaps the houses or structures are built on stilts or some other means to keep them up from whether it floods just naturally or if the levees ever break. Remember Esgaroth from The Hobbit that was built on the Long Lake. Tolkien had supposedly seen a city like this in the Alps that inspired him for this. People are going to live in such structures if there's an economic reason for them to do so. Super rich farmland that's in a delta area that does flood occasionally would be that. Epic rivers also have large fish stocks, and crustaceans or whatever that could sustain people both economically and just to survive. But they could also support all sorts of fantastical underwater monsters that could be devil communities that live along the rivers or travel over its waters. And of course, in an epic river where you've got this huge area where the river flows into the sea, you have this crossing point between salt and fresh water where the creatures of these two areas could mix together. Epic rivers can also be very deep and very treacherous. The Amazon is notoriously deep in certain areas. You have like the Congo River in Africa, which has areas where it just roars through, very dangerous. You can have shipwrecks on these rivers that are inaccessible because of the depth and current. These are the kind of rivers that it's difficult to even cross in a boat, much less salvage or wreck. Here's another thing at this point about rivers. Think about the speed of the river, the sound that it makes, the color of the water, the smells. These are things you describe to the players. The Emerald River is obviously emerald color, right? And this becomes part of its personality. This epic river is something that is celebrated in song and legend. Because of the bounty that it brings its inhabitants, it's a sacred place. If you have an epic river that has a waterfall, this is significant as well. I did a video on this on waterfalls. You think of Niagara Falls or Victoria Falls. These are epic rivers which have epic waterfalls. There's always something either behind or around this sort of waterfall in a fantasy setting. All right, so the next type of river are tributaries, and these always flow into an epic river, not out of it, because it is gravity that determines where the river flows, and the epic river has the water flow. It's always going to create the deepest channel as it flows. That doesn't mean that tributaries are necessarily small. You have rivers in the United States like the Missouri or the Ohio that flow into the Mississippi, but they're big-ass rivers. So part of the cool things about tributaries is you can create on your map a whole network of these flowing into your epic river. These provide transportation sources that go in all sorts of areas. It's a huge network almost of roads. So traveling on these tributaries or the epic river, easy downstream, right? You can have flatboats like they used to have in the 19th century in the United States. You'd build them upstream, come down with goods or people or whatever, and then, break them apart when they got to the end. In a fantasy setting, you could have a large flatboat, much larger than the real ones. But you can also have a boat that's powered magically. If you have airships that have magic power, you could have sort of a steamboat type flatboat that could travel up and down the river. Now, I tend to hesitate to do this. I don't like to introduce too much technology like the airships, weapons and this sort of thing. I sometimes think it gets a little squishy and unbalanced. You can have other things. You can have animals. This was very common to pull ships upstream. They had paths along rivers. And in D&D, you can get very creative. Say owl bears that have been trained to haul these massive flatboats up rivers. So the most common way, though, to take boats upstream on a river is to have rowers. And these can be pretty big ships. The Vikings in 855 AD famously took, they say, between 300 and 700 of their long ships, depending on the source. They went up the Seine and they sacked Paris. Each of those ships could hold 100 people. So imagine that sort of thing in some epic battle scene in D&D. But in a more ordinary sense, these are the sort of ships that could be used to transport people or goods upstream. If you've got the rowers, they can go up. And then on the way back, it's just a means of steering with them. If you were transporting goods from a major city or town way up a river to a remote village, those goods are going to be highly valuable. And the people in this village may have some natural resource that they trade for these goods, such that then you go downstream and make more money. And these ships would need guards. I know it's a cliche, but come on, there's a reason it's a cliche. The player characters. And then you can go down to smaller and smaller boats, all the way to a canoe that people can use to go upriver and come back down. The thing about traveling on a river is you can't get lost. It provides some protection being in the middle of a river as opposed to traveling through unbroken wilderness. So you want to think about when you're creating the tributaries, your epic rivers, you're going to go into areas where potentially you want your players to go to. You have some tributary that goes into some super remote wilderness area. That gives the players a way to go in and get back out. You could do this theater of the mind. It makes sense. And again, they're going to meet something for sure on the river. Because just like epic rivers, tributaries provide food and fresh water to any creature in the area. When the players move through here, they're going to, it's not random monsters that they're running into. These are creatures that are either using the river as a food source or using those that come to the river as a food source. Now you want to scale this accordingly. If you have a river that's flowing through a very settled area of farmland, you're not going to run into necessarily the sort of nasty creatures that you would some river going through, the dark forest in some unknown area, because that's going to be nasty. So finally, we have the category of exotic rivers, and these could include the classical exotic river, which flows through a desert from some more humid or area and then sort of dissipates in this desert. But I'm going to include things in the exotic category, like a temporary river, which only has water during the rainy season, an extinct riverbed. Now, these often have giant boulders in them, which makes walking through them very difficult terrain. You can have a gorge that has rapids that make it impossible to cross or sail on. And the gorge is the classic site for a very high rope suspension bridge. The players know whenever they go across this kind of thing, an encounter may be nearby. But you can also have a river that meanders in all sorts of directions and creates a whole maze network of rivers that can be very difficult to figure your way through. Because if you don't have a character that can make these survival checks or has some background that justifies, they can find their way through this maze of rivers, they could totally get lost and not be able to find their way out. And you tell them this before they go in, this maze, because it could be a mile in diameter or 10 miles or even bigger. And this is notorious as a place where people get lost. Which brings us to another element of all rivers, but more so I think in exotic rivers, what happens if the players lose their boats? They're either attacked or they get caught in some rapids and the boats get smashed. Now they're out in the middle of nowhere, untracked wilderness. They've got to get their way back. And the thing about the exotic is they're in the burning desert. They're in the swamp or jungle. Much more difficult than just getting out and asking the local farmer if I can borrow their cart. All right, so to end this, I'm going to add an extra category that all rivers have, and that is the source of the river. Throughout history, the sources of rivers, especially your epic rivers, have always been a special place. You have shrines, you have temples, very significant religious importance to these sources. Because there is something inherently compelling about a tiny little spring that one knows is going to flow inexorably downhill until it becomes an epic river like the Mississippi or the Amazon. Now, in the real world, the Amazon actually does not have one source. There's 4 different rivers that people argue, is this the true source or that? But here's the thing. If you're going to have an Amazon-type river in your world, have one source. Because this source is going to be a sacred site to all sorts of creatures and NPCs. Think about druids who understand that water is perhaps the most sacred substance vital to all life forms, the source of an epic river is going to be important to them. They are not going to want to see it defiled. But you have other fey creatures, elementals and things that also see this area as divine and sacred. And the thing about D&D is the source, the spring of an epic river is going to lead somewhere. Might be epic, like the plane of water elementals, but it might also be something a little more mundane, some sacred pool in the Underdark. But there's always going to be something behind this because of the way D&D, the game mechanics. Because what you're doing here is you're combining the real-world fascination that we all have to the source of an epic river, and then combining that with the magical elements that are an inherent part of gameplay and storytelling in D&D. And this is part of the reason why rivers make such an excellent area for storytelling and encounters, because they have this significance in all human cultures that can be translated into the world of D&D. So if you've liked this discussion and others on my channel, please subscribe, please leave some comments, but most importantly, my friends, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.